Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I am the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
Here we go, Josh. This is going to be interesting.
I'm so sorry. See, I thought that I was like, we've been watching newer movies. We've been trying to catch up with things that have come out over the last year. And I was like, you know what? Let's go. Let's watch an older movie. And I was listening to a podcast. I was listening to Yorgos Lanthimos on the WTF podcast with Mark Maron. And he said, like, oh, what movies do you watch? Who are some of your favorite filmmakers? And he brought up two filmmakers specifically initially. One was Tarkovsky and the other was John Cassavetes. And I was like, hey, I've never seen any of John Cassavetes' movies. And I've heard of him, and I knew he was an actor, and I knew he had some stuff to do with, like improv or kind of like cinema verite. But I'd never seen any of his movies. And they specifically talked about A Woman Under the Influence. And it's right about like 30 minutes into the podcast. But they specifically talked about A Woman Under the Influence and Gina Roland's performance. And I asked you if you'd seen it, like after I'd listened to that podcast. You said no, but you said that she was nominated for an Academy Award. I was like, oh, great. Okay, this is perfect. So this will be the movie that we watch. And this will be, an older movie that we can talk about on the podcast. And I'm sorry, because it's a rough movie.
I have nothing but great things to say, so I want to make it clear
me too.
That it's all coming from the positive, meaning that the film affected me. And I mean every single thing as compliments. I believe this is emotional torture. This film is emotionally torturing people who watch it. And that, I know it sounds strange for me to say that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. But if you're in the wrong frame of mind or you're in a strange disposition in this world, it might speak to you differently than it spoke to me. But I just feel like this was just so hardcore to get through. It's so rough. And like I said, I'll repeat it 1,000 times. These are all compliments. It is traumatizing, this film. Her performance, his performance, Peter Falk's performance they're traumatizing. And what John Cassavetes does is traumatizing. And I was a baby of the 70s, so I was 8, 9, 10, around this, when this film was released. And I remember seeing trailers, and I remember seeing clips, and I remember seeing posters, and I remember seeing it at the movie theater. And I always had this instinct that I was afraid of this film. And there's another movie called Unmarried Woman. And I had this instinct about these movies that they were going to leave me with something in the pit of my stomach. And I was completely 100% correct, because this movie is just devastating. It's like really nothing I've ever seen before, because I'm not sure how much dialogue is real and how much was improv and how much they had just written down. I know I did some research, and I know John Cassavetes wrote this as a play intended for Gina Roland to star in it, but she was like, there's no way any actress could do this 8 nights a week or 8 times a week. And then he turned it into a screenplay, and he had a lot of trouble getting financing. He got a lot of trouble getting it to be seen. He had a lot of trouble with it. He ended up with an Oscar nomination, and she ended up with an Oscar nomination. Well deserved. But, coming out of the high of the Oscars, and even if you just recently watched The Favorite, which is a very hardcore movie to watch on some level, there's nothing in the last 6 months of us watching, even Suspiria, does not set you up for the frame of mind you need to get through this film. It was tough. So you don't have to apologize. I do want to say thank you that I have seen my second John Cassavetes film. The first one being Gloria, also starring his wife, Gina Roland, also nominated for the Oscar for her for Best Actress. So I am happy I'm seeing his films, but I know his son's movies more than I know his, and I'm starting to think maybe there's some reason why. So thank you.
Well, it's funny because we talk about, we're talking about it like, that's kind of like torture for the viewer, but it makes sense that this is one of Yorgos Lanthimos' favorite filmmakers, that he's, and even what he said in the podcast was that, especially now that he's made, multiple movies, he's seeking out the people that made things that changed cinema in a way that and he's also looking to be, he said he was looking for people that can affect him by their films. He said that he can still be affected by film, even though he knows how it works. Like, he's made films, he's been in the industry. So when he comes across something, or when he experiences something that is able to transcend that and able to, make him look past the, like, I know how they got that shot. Oh, I wonder if they were using a dolly there. Or, oh man, that must have been difficult. This is a really long take, that had to be hard. Or they're working with children, so those children must have been really difficult to work with, but they did a really good job. He's not thinking about any of that stuff. He's just living in the moment of this movie. And that, so it makes sense that somebody like John Cassavetes, or I also haven't watched it yet, but I also rented Stalker by Tarkovsky, which is one of his later films. So I've only seen Solaris, so that's the only one I've seen, but I know he's got some really crazy movies out there. So I'm just trying to pace myself, I guess. But anyway, so with this film, that's kind of like what made me seek it out. But I was well, first of all, I guess before I get into that, let's just say very quickly, for anybody who hasn't seen it, it's a movie about a husband and wife, and she has mental illness, and they have 3 kids, and then it's a lot of family scenes and interactions, and you get to see how she interacts with children, how she interacts with adults, and how she doesn't fit into the proper society that everyone else expects her to fit into, and how she deals with it, or tries to deal with it, and how her husband deals with it. And it is definitely not one of these things where you necessarily only feel bad for the husband because he has to deal with a mentally ill wife, but at the same time you see, I think both of the main characters are sympathetic, but then at the same time he's complicit in some of the things that are going on in her life. So it's rough, but I've never even really seen Peter Falk in anything other than Columbo and The Princess Bride. So I'm, seeing him in this movie, it's making me look at him in a different light. So, and I guess he was kind of like in the middle of his Columbo-ness while doing this movie, and Husbands, another John Cassavetes movie, which I've started, reading about. So yeah, that's really cool that he was dedicated to independent cinema, which I guess was fairly new in the ways that Cassavetes was making his movies, like self-funding and all that stuff. That wasn't normal, carrying around your films and putting it in theaters, any theater that'll show it, or trying to get into all these different film festivals and things like that. That's the starting point for this movie. And then the way that they decide to introduce you to the character is by, her husband can't come home. It's a date night. Husband can't go home. So she ends up gravitating towards a bar. And then I don't even think she's looking to be picked up by a guy, but a guy takes her home, and things go on from there. But it kind of, it makes you, and I guess when in watching other films and seeing other TV shows, other characters that you're used to seeing, you kind of expect something out of this character initially, and then you see, especially the next morning, that she wasn't really sure. She was out of her element at the bar and with this other guy, and didn't really even understand what was going on, I guess. And so that, to me, it was kind of shocking as an entrance to this character. And then as you see how she interacts with her kids and with adults, it gets more complicated from then on. So, that's a bold way to start the movie, but then the movie just keeps building and building and building. So, I don't really know where to go, other than I will talk about very quickly the technical side of this movie. And it is so unnerving how the music is used and how he uses abrupt cuts. It, especially at the beginning of the movie, it is just it hurts my brain when he does certain things where he's either in the middle of a song and he cuts to, whatever, the truck driving down the road, we're a totally different place, no music, or the way that somebody might be even in the middle of a word and then it cuts to the next day or a different place. And I think obviously it's meant to do that, but from a filmmaking standpoint, that's counterintuitive to what we're used to as an audience. And I think he's utilizing that, our expectations, and he's circumventing that and forcing us to feel a certain way, to feel off kilter, and to feel that kind of edginess. And also that helps to build tension and keep ratcheting up the tension throughout some of these scenes. And then he uses a lot of long takes closer to the end of the movie, which also are just dreadful in that they build dread because something's going to happen and you just don't know when. And we talk about, certain scenes that Kubrick's done and ways that other filmmakers have been able to utilize that. But I think, especially with this movie and maybe with other movies, I don't know, I think Cassavetes has a good handle on what his audience expects and how to prolong that dread. So, man, I'm not really doing a good job of selling it as a movie that people might want to see, but maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think there are certain films out there that should come with an open disclaimer. And there's a film called The Boy with the Striped Pajamas. And I just think that, like, if somebody asks me if they should see that film, I think I should legitimately be able to say blah, blah, blah happens at the end and not feel bad about it and not say spoiler, because I don't think people are ready. They're just not ready. This is a film of 2.5 hours of those moments that you can't possibly say to anybody, hey, see this movie, because if you love movies and you love acting and you love the whole idea of a director telling a story, even though people have done it throughout the last 40 years, Paul Thomas Anderson, Yorgos Lanthimos, all these people have done these things. This stuff that John Cassavetes does in this film seems fresh and new, even though this movie is 1974. It's things that I'm not expecting to see in a film that's 1974. But irregardless of that, it just has this unusual vibe about it. And sometimes some of the best stories in the world, The Old Man and the Sea, I remember hearing about that book for decades. And then finally I read it and I was like, okay, wait a second. What happens at the end of that book? Are you kidding me? All that time, and what's the point? So sometimes things are not happily ever after, and that's okay. This is just a challenging film because it's so dynamic in the way that it's directed. It's so dynamic in the way that it's acted. It's so dynamic in the way that he chooses to hold on certain things and then cut away from other certain things. You're absolutely correct. In the middle of a scene, it just stops and keeps going to something else. And you're like, okay, did I get the amount of information from what I just saw that I needed to see? Obviously, that's it. And sometimes directors do that just because it's the unusual choice to do that. Cassavetes has a purpose every time he does that. We are no longer in the same frame of mind if he cuts from one thing and then goes to the traffic with no music. It is jaunting, but it has purpose. Because I think what he's doing, and I'm literally just thinking this right now, I think what he's doing is he's trying to give us an idea of what her mind frame is without having seen it. Like, you see her in her thought process, but I actually think the way that he handles some of the shots and some of the camera angles and some of especially the short cuts that he does, it's almost like that's probably what her mind and the pacing of her thought process is like. So I think it's important. And I'm not sure, because you probably know this a little bit better than me, but when did handheld cameras become such a thing? Like, is it more modern, or has that always been a thing?
Well, no, I think there was a cinema verite is what they would call it, that a movement. And that was when they started doing a lot of purposeful, handheld, gritty filmmaking as opposed to having it on a tripod or on a dolly or on a crane or something like that, where it's more locked down. So, and that was, I believe, in the late 60s, early 70s, or maybe more early 70s, where that was starting to be used.
So is it my imagination, or does he use a handheld camera in some of these scenes and then cuts away to a lockdown camera? There's a scene in particular where they're running up and down the stairs, and when they're downstairs and he's shooting them, it looks like it's handheld. And then they run up the stairs, and that
Yeah.
happens a couple times in the film. So I don't even remember particularly what moment it was. But when he shoots back over the top of the staircase, that's a locked on shot. But then when he goes back down, it seems like it's a handheld camera. And also, he does this incredible thing where the camera is not at eye level to the characters most of the film. It's
Lower.
usually shot from
Mhm.
knee level up, or yeah, especially in the party scenes at the end. There's a lot of handheld looking shots. I'm not sure what he does there, but a lot of and that's been done before, where you see audience or people at a party from their feet and that kind of stuff, and usually it's from a kid's point of view. But there's a shot in particular when they first all pile in for this party, finger quotes, that it's over off of their dining room bedroom, which is an unusual thing too. That whole dining room bedroom thing is bizarre to me. What? I've never seen anything like that before in a big house. Like, do they not have the rooms upstairs? What was that all about? And why would you not do like a half living room, half bedroom? Why would you do a half dining room off the kitchen? It's odd. And if anybody's seen this film, they know what I'm talking about. I guess this just sets you up with the imbalance of what this woman's life is going to be like, because that's pretty much how the film starts and where it starts in that area. So in that party scene, there's a shot and it comes back from where the couch, fold out couch or bed is. And then it comes up and sort of does this waist line shot of the whole crowd, and then comes up and over top of them. And I was like, that is really unusual, because is that supposed to show us that this is going to be her perspective if and when she comes home to this party after getting out of this mental institution? It got to the point where things were so interesting and so technically pronounced that I stopped trying to think about it and just was feeling what I was feeling when I was watching it. And there are a lot of people who have described this film as making them nauseated. And I think people would attribute that to her loss of sanity, or her downhill decline into insanity, or into more insanity, if you will. But it's not. For me, it's all of the way that he does those shots. That shot at close to the end where the guy falls down the hill,
Mm-hmm.
it's very unusual, because you're like, did Peter Falk's character do something to make him fall?
He kind of did. He
just
kind of like
fall
shook.
because
He was going underneath
Yeah.
that rope, and he kind of, I don't know if he did it on purpose to shake the rope or if he's just trying to get underneath it. But ultimately, because of what he did, it made that guy fall.
Yeah. Well, the point to all that is that it makes you feel so odd and out of sorts. And that's a really good thing. Once again, the disclaimer, which was the start of this part of the conversation, was how do you explain to people, okay, this is a really important movie by a really important director with a really important performance? Because I've heard about this performance for decades, Gina Rollins. And how do you set somebody up, or do you even bother? Do you go, yeah, go see that film? You need to see that film and just let them explore it for what it is, because that's what happened to us. And I'm joking around about a disclaimer, but at the same time, it's kind of like I feel bad telling people, not bad. There's certain people I can tell, and certain people I would be like, yeah, you're not going to groove on that film. So the point to all that is that everything is set up for you to immediately feel everything you're feeling during the film. And that's an amazing experience, especially with such a daunting subject matter that this is. And I have some questions about her sanity too. We got to get to that.
Well, we can, but so I want you to talk a little bit about her performance, because I don't know how, I mean, we can talk about it. I don't know if there's a difference between her performance in 1974 and us looking at it, now, if there was a different viewpoint of mental illness back then versus now. Obviously, the things that they did to treat mental illness were totally different back then, with shock therapy and all that stuff. I mean, it was a lot more extreme, the things that they were doing. I mean, now it's mainly drugs, I guess, but I don't know if that character would have been played any differently today versus back then. But as far as how Gina Rollins took on that character and the affectations that she used, to me, it never felt like it was pantomime or fake or disingenuous. But I also don't know how you would. I mean, there are certain things that she kind of used, like kind of the kind of the mouth thing that she did, and using her thumbs and kind of doing the whole like hitchhike whatever that
Zip.
thing is.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was using
Yeah.
certain kind of keystones or touch points to go back to, and a lot of the things that she was doing, but it never felt like it was overacting to me. But I don't know. What did you feel like? I mean, obviously it's a revered performance, and do you feel like it was warranted the accolades it got?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you 100%. There is nothing disingenuous about this performance, which leads me to the bigger question. I think as an actor, the only way to approach this for me would be to never really think, what does a crazy person do? She's just doing what she is inclined to do. And it's out of step with what other people think is normal. So I have two questions here, which could be a great way for an actor to find that character. And I think that she's always done those little zips, bloop, 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 things that she does, and all of that, like, neck cutting off thing that she does, and, the whole like get out of here thing she does with her fingers. She's probably done that her whole entire life. It's just in the last couple of years with children and her becoming middle age and you know people probably experiencing her on a face-to-face level that is starting to become an issue because people don't know how to take that. So as an actor, I personally would approach it as the same way I do everything else. What's the intention? What am I trying to get out of the scene? What do I want from the other actor? What do I want to do to get what I need from the scene? And for me, that would lead to all the bings and whistles and ticks and stuff like that. But she found something that I think only she could have found in that moment. And I'm sure other actresses could have found other stuff and other actors could have interpreted it a different way. But she found things that really just grounded herself as a person first and then as a character second, which led me to my first question is she mentally unstable, or are we as a society not able to handle somebody like that? Because in my opinion, and this is my second question, but it's also more of a statement, everybody else around her was if you had taken Peter Falk out of the movie and just showed me one scene, I would have thought at some point he's playing a mentally unstable person. And they do and say things that kind of entice her on some level to she's acting like who she is.
Yeah.
But they say and do things. Her mother, her father, which there's that weird scene at the end. Like, what was that all about? We'll get to that. Her husband, the people around her, the children's friends' father, they all interpret her behavior as unsettled and disturbed when she's just getting through life. Like, would she really look like a crazy person on the side of the road if somebody had just stopped and given her the time that she needed to know what time the bus was coming for her kids? Like, didn't those people who refused to give her the time, they looked as crazy to me as she does on the side of the road? Like, why the hell would you not just stop and say it's 9:15? How hard is that? Because she's coming across as a crazy person? She also comes across as a very frustrated, impatient mother who can't wait to see her children and does not know what time it is. So the anxiety of not knowing what time it is. So in my opinion, she comes across just honest and genuine, which is a good word for it, to where I think it's our interpretation as a society that makes her crazy. Now, later on in the film, you start to see things that might make it look like, she is disturbed or unsettled in her mental capacity.
Yeah, I think as the movie goes along, I don't think that she necessarily changes. That the things that her character does, they don't necessarily change. It's all the people around her that are changing, and whether it's her husband, the Peter Falk character, whether how he either ramps up very quickly to combat her, what she's trying to do. I mean, there's a couple scenes, the spaghetti scene when he brings over all of his guys to have spaghetti. And I think he's doing that to he's doing it for a couple of reasons. He's doing that to kind of show her that he was with these guys that the night before, and that they all worked really hard and they all just wanted a good meal or whatever. But that those scenes, you can see how there is a tenuous balance of civility and of the proper etiquette and way to interact, and how very quickly that can break down when one person challenges that. And she's not challenging that civility or that that formalism because she wants to break it up and she's an anarchist or anything like that. She's just doing it because she doesn't see those boundaries. She doesn't see why herself being an attractive woman going over there and really getting in front of somebody and push. She didn't even physically really be around him, and that is, and what Peter Falk says even later on is it's he was giving you a look, and it's like, was he giving you a look? Probably not. I'm sure he felt, well, I know he felt very uncomfortable. Everybody felt uncomfortable when she started kind of pressing him to sing, the guy at the end of the table next to her husband. It broke down so quickly because everyone was uncomfortable except for her. And really in a open, less strictured society, everybody would have been okay. She would have asked him to sing. He would have sang. He wouldn't have felt bad about singing. Everybody would have been fine. They would have still had a lot of fun and they would have moved on. But in this scenario, all the other guys know, if it was my wife and some other guy was, making eyes at her, I'd want to shut that down too. And so that's why that whole tension was there. And so she's living in a world that isn't as open and free as she is. And in that world, she's considered mentally ill.
Well, see, that's what's troublesome to me. That in the end is what bothers me the most. And I love how he balances the two lead characters because they are balanced extremely well. They do, Peter Falk and Gina Rowland as their respective characters, both do things that are questioned in a societal eye, in a child behavioral upbringing way. The scene when he's taking the kids to the beach, he's as out of it in that scene as she is in anything else that she does throughout the film. And then in the back of the truck on the way home, he keeps giving the one kid beer, gives them all a sip of beer. And it's all cute because in society, it's really cute when somebody gives a young kid a little sip of beer because they're going to go, ugh, that's disgusting. But that's not what happens in that scene. And he continues to say the same thing over and over again. Just take a little bit. Just take a little bit. People won't like it if you take too much. Just take a little bit. And isn't that the modern day of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result? And then the way he handles them when they get off the truck and they're acting all crazy, like maybe a little bit drunk kid. I'm not sure the kids are necessarily intoxicated. Although the first kid probably has a little bit of a buzz because he does take 3 or 4 major sips off that beer. But then he's kind of does that frustrating father thing where he's like, you guys got to go inside. And I'm like, dude, you're the one who gave him beer. You're the one who took him to the beach. You're the one who spun them out of control. And now you want them to maintain because they're not acting the way that you think that they should be acting. It's just like you were just talking about that table scene. I think the most uncomfortable part to that is when she's feeling up on the guy and she's like, look at those muscles and look how beautiful that face is. You're a beautiful, beautiful man. Literally, she does nothing wrong. I mean, she does nothing wrong. She's not sexually attracted to him per se. She's just making it a statement that she finds him really attractive.
But that's because we know her at this point in the film. But that other guy has not really ever met her. So, he may think, everybody else. I think it's not even that he thinks that she's coming on to him. It's that he thinks that her husband thinks that he likes her coming on to him. I almost ran out of breath saying that sentence. It's this social thing. It's not even that he's like, man, I really want to get with this woman. He's like, man, I really don't want, I don't know if he's their foreman or what, but he's like, man, I really don't want my boss or my coworker to think that I want to get with his wife, because like, that's not cool. And I know that's not cool. And I want everybody else to know that I know that's not cool. So everybody around that table is doing that whole thing, and except for her, and they have to process that.
What's fascinating about that to me is that by their standards, they make her the mentally ill one.
Yes.
Because they can't handle their feelings. She's the mentally ill one. I think it says a lot of stuff. I think Cassavetes was a man out of his time. I think he says a lot of stuff that would be very, very important to the Me Too movement nowadays. And not to get on a political soapbox, but we're in a different society, and we should be in a different society. We should be aware that people should not take advantage of women because they can and because they sexualize them so they are sexual. We shouldn't do that. Everybody on some base level should know that that's wrong. But to stigmatize a female, a wife, a mother, a woman, based on how you're uncomfortable around the way that she acts and stigmatizing that into mental illness is beyond disturbing. It's perplexing to think about. And I kept thinking to myself, yes, she probably would make me feel uncomfortable, but I'm an artist in heart and in my soul. And I've been around a lot of artists who are artists for real, like living it, making money, all that stuff. And they are out of step with what would be socially acceptable in certain times. And, all the way down from eating with your fingers at a meal, which blew my friend's mind once when we were invited that dinner. I'm like, what's the difference between now and when you were 5 years old? Big deal. When you eat fried chicken, you're going to lick your fingers. It's the same thing. But they just thought it was the most bizarre thing, and that she was a hippie and that she was like loose and just mentally not all there, and how, it wasn't even really a bacterial thing. It was just so unusual to be invited to a dinner party where you didn't really use your fingers. There was pita bread and Indian food and stuff like that. And that's how some cultures eat. And that's how we were going to eat the meal. No one calls anybody crazy for trying to use chopsticks in a Chinese restaurant. What's the difference? So that whole point is that I'm blown away by the phenomenon of this film being more about how I would feel in those situations, which of course it's me watching it. So of course I'm going to personalize it. But I kept saying to myself, I can hear what she's saying and how they're interpreting it, but it's not bothering me. I don't think she's mentally ill. Like the kids' party scene where she keeps saying, dance of death.
Yeah, she's like, die like a swan. Dying. Yeah, die for your daddy.
Die like a swan. And then when you see the little girl, you're like, oh, that's how a swan dies in Swan Lake. Okay, yeah, I get what you're doing. And then she turns to the guy and she's like, look how great they die. I hear what she's saying, and I understand that might be unnerving to people. And actually, that's the only character in the movie that I think has any basis to think that she's mentally unhinged. And from just meeting her and seeing those kind of things, because she doesn't have any kind of reservation towards that kind of stuff. She's definitely doing her thing. But the kids are loving it and they're having a great time. So I am perplexed and intrigued and blown away by how this film says so much about how we perceive what is mental illness versus what might not be mental illness, and how, because you're a little bit more structured and a little bit more conducive to societal values, what your behavior, if she did what Peter Falk does at some point in the film, she would definitely be condemned as being mentally unhinged. But yet no one ever says that to him.
Yeah.
No one ever says to him, you shouldn't talk that way. You shouldn't act that way. The doctor in the doctor scene and the mother in that same scene, it's like some kind of Alice in Wonderland reality where everybody but Gina Rowland probably should be committed, but yet they're the ones who are saying she's crazy, and they blatantly say, you're crazy. And the mother, that one shot up against the staircase where she's like that, she's always been like that, and she's crazy. And doctor, I was like, if you could see how you're acting, mom, you would see that you seem mentally unhinged way more than Gina Rowland did. So I find it fascinating that he was able to, John Cassavetes, because he wrote it too, he was able to explore these subject matters without an on the nose presentation of it. It never makes a statement about itself. It just makes its own story, and then you take what the statement is from it. Fascinating, great filmmaking, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that we also kind of just, and maybe even more so back then, I don't know, but you would all kind of assume that everyone in their homes are, just living these idyllic lives, that there's no crazy is a bad word when I'm trying to explain it, but there's no over the top outbursts of emotion and everybody's got their stuff together. But in this film, it kind of shows you how even what you would expect the most reserved, like the Peter Falk's mom, you would expect her to be the most reserved. She ends up exploding because she sees, I'm sure she's processing a lot too. She sees what she believes is a threat to her son, a threat to her grandchildren, and she wants to get it handled. She wants to get it taken care of, and she is acting out. She is yelling out and trying to get her opinions known. And they got the doctor there. You're talking about the scene where they're going to commit her. They're going to inject her with a sedative so that they can put her in the car and take her to a mental hospital. And they have, I think the mom is seeing where, especially because Peter Falk goes back and forth. He is back and forth and in and out on this thing, and like, no, everybody leave. We don't need you guys anymore. It's just us. He's in that kind of like we're in it together thing, and I think that's got to be unhealthy for his wife too, because he's so back and forth with it, and and you see it throughout the film as far as how he handles her physically. He hits her multiple times in the movie, and I know at some point he hits her and knocks her down onto the floor, and she says something like, "I know you've never done that before." So maybe it's not a thing that is a consistent aspect of their relationship, but we do see him hit her, later on in the film too. So, but still, the way he shifts quickly between having empathy for her and wanting to console her, and then just completely rejecting her and telling her she needs to, shape up, or she needs to not be weird, or she doesn't know what she's doing when she's in front of other people. He doesn't have a consistent message for her, and he's not a consistent support structure for her, because I'm sure he's dealing with stuff too, but she really would need a consistent support structure and a consistent focus that she's not getting, and she's not able to live the way that she would want to naturally live, I guess. But I don't know. I don't know how else. I mean, I feel bad for the kids because they're in the middle of all of that, and they shouldn't, no kid should ever have to see something like that. Their parents literally fighting it but it's not even fighting as in like one's on one side, one's on the other side. It's a kind of struggle for a solution to something that there's no real clear solution for. And the kids still have to process all that stuff. And we don't get to see any of the scenes of like the father sitting down explaining to the kids where their mom is and any of that. But at the same time, he has irrational feelings on his own. He's the one who brings over the 50 people to welcome her back. What's the thing that they're trying to help her integrate into society? So now you're going to bring literally everyone she knows plus more people into a situation where she's gone from being focused and trying to figure out in quotes how to be normal and how to be a normal person in society while they shock her and all that stuff, and then you throw her right back in to essentially like probably the most difficult social situation she could imagine. He wasn't thinking about it. He was just trying to, I don't know what he was trying to do. I don't know what his motivation was there, but nobody said no to him until like the very end, until right as she was coming home. So that confused me, but it does go to show you. And then also later on in the movie, how he deals with the sides, whether he sides with her or sides with the rest of the family, he bounces back and forth on that too. And so it's like he's schizophrenic and she's consistent.
Well, that's why I said the statement in the beginning of the podcast that it seems to me that everybody else's behavior, if you were to take it out of the context of what you've seen in the film and just showed that scene of the mother in the corner riveting, she's crazy, she ghetto doctor. You know, if you just watch that, there's not one human being that would not say that woman, is she in a mental institution? Because she seems disturbed at that moment. And then when the doctor's like doing that thing where he's like, I'm here to help you. I'm not here to hurt you. I would never do anything. You know me. I'm your friend. I'm here to help you. Dude, like creepy on so many levels, like in his hair sticking out and the way he rubs it back. And then Peter Falk makes no sense to me as a character. I mean, I understand what they're doing. And I think, honestly and truthfully, for me, what I've taken from this film is be careful of how you judge somebody else's sanity, because the people who are saying she is crazy seem unstable to me. And I was sort of trying to convince myself of that throughout the film, because I said, you know, her standing on the side of the road asking for what time it was is not unsettling. Now, when you see just that clip of her going, what time is it? Why won't you give me the time? That's the clip they show when they talk about this performance. Yes, she seems unsettled, but in context of the scene, it's making perfect sense. She's having, you know, I just talked about that. But the point to that is that I was unsure, and I kept saying, is John Cassavetes trying to tell us, be careful of everybody else around you, because you might just be free thinking, free flowing, artist type person, and everybody else wants to confine you to the conformity of society, because Peter Falk acts all kinds of left of center throughout this movie. And then at the very end, what does he do? He calls her to a face-to-face conversation and says, just be you, just be you. And he starts making the noises that she traditionally makes. And so what do you want? You just spent 6 months, you committed your wife, and you obviously have issues with it because you don't want to talk about it at work. And there's obviously anger issues that come up because you hurt somebody else because of it. Not to justify any of that stuff, because that stuff seems to me unbalanced as much as anything else that Gina Rowland does. Actually, it seems much more unbalanced. And then you finally get your wife home, and she is actually trying to maintain. She's confined and she's in control. And she even says, I'm trying to do what they taught me in. It was so much easier. You woke up, they gave you your meds, you go to therapy, and she's talking very calm and cool and collected. And then every single person in that scene tries to bait her into being crazy. You know, we don't really want to hear about that. Oh, darling, that's not is that an appropriate conversation? The one mother says. And then the father, what is the deal with her father? Like, he doesn't show up until the end of the film. Is there some kind of like inappropriate sexual relationship that happened with her? Because when she's hugging him and that whole scene, it's odd. And it's not odd because of father-daughter showing each other affection. It's odd because there's just things being said that are just, they're dripping with subtext that there's something there. And then the father sits.
It makes you wonder if he's just ashamed of his daughter. I mean, it could be something as, you know, as simple as he's ashamed of who his daughter is and all of the issues that his daughter, that he might believe that his daughter has created. And that, I mean, I could see that. And when she said, you know, why don't you stick up for me, or stand up for me? She said, why don't you stand up for me? He's too closed off, or I don't know. I mean, and I'm guessing that especially, you know, back then, even more, you know, men probably weren't men might have been more closed off by then. Yeah, right. Back then. Yeah.
But there's also this feeling like if they had just been more supportive of this just didn't happen. This just didn't happen to this 30-year-old woman. She's been like this most of her life, and maybe they didn't handle it the best, and maybe that's why he's feeling sorry, and like they didn't do enough to either say, hey, you are a free thinking human being, but in this social convention, here's what's appropriate, here's what's not. For my personal opinion, she is more of not autism, but
Asperger's.
Asperger's. Yes, they have personal boundary issues. They either are too much in your personal space, or they don't want you in their personal space. A lot of her attributes reminded me of somebody who had Asperger's. So maybe they didn't know, as parents, they didn't know how to raise this child. They didn't know how to be thinking, a liberal thinker, and have her also conform to what society needed her to conform to. I get all that. And I can justify how a parent would be just at wit's end with something like this, especially when it comes to grandchildren. And everybody's so worried about the grandchildren. I'm like, be worried about your daughter, because your daughter's raising your grandchildren. So, it just makes the parent, I feel like it makes the parent, when you say, I worry about your kids, it makes them feel inadequate to be their parents. So either give me some really good advice on how to be a better parent, or don't say that stuff around my kids, and don't say that to me about my kids. But then there's that shot of the father at the dinner table, and he's looking almost satisfied that she is becoming, in front of them, less controlled and more like what they think is crazy. There's this weird satisfaction on his face. And I might be misreading it as something that's not there, but it struck me odd. It's like, why does he come in at the last minute? Why is this character not explored before this? There has to be a reason why he held him out of the script up to this point. There has to be something there. And I'm sure everybody involved in this film has a different opinion of why she does what she does, and he does what he does, and the father does what he does. And then, of course, John Cassavetes, being an artist that he is, probably is like, whatever your interpretation is, how you felt is good with me. Or he might be the strict advocate of, no, this guy meant this. And I would like to go to a film school and class and learn about a movie like this, because I feel like people who have an understanding of what John Cassavetes meant based on history that he's been talked about, meaning he's talked about it. I don't know if there is. I'm sure there is. I'd like to do more research to try to understand if what I was feeling is what he was meaning. But in the long run, there's so much depth and darkness and gravitas and harshness and muck and just down in the soil, underground stuff that you can cling on to just as an audience member to watch this. And you would think that a person, for me, I came out feeling unsettled, but at the same time, I also felt like the next time I see somebody like that on the side of the road, I might treat him or her with more kid gloves, because I might not be interpreting what they're going through the right way. Like I just thought to myself, would I be one of those people who stopped and gave her the time? Okay, they're in LA. They're obviously an Italian family from the north, probably New York. There's no mention of that, but they seem very New York-ish. And she's like, hey, you got to watch right there. I can see, just tell me what time it is. Probably in New York, not a big deal. Maybe in LA in the 70s, that was a little bit more abrasive than anybody could deal with. But it did make me walk out of the film going, maybe I'm misinterpreting what they mean based on how I feel about how somebody else is acting. And that's not necessarily that person is unhinged or disturbed or mentally ill. It could be just my interpretation of how they're existing in this world is not how they feel. So be careful of how much you're saying, God, that person's crazy. Because,
Yeah.
she seemed to be high functioning. She's raised 3 children, the age of 10 to 9, 8, however old they are. They obviously go to school on time. She was able to remember their bikes. And what is crazy, I guess, is the question of the film for me.
Well, and I think that kind of brings up my next question, which is, what do you think about the title? The title being A Woman Under the Influence. And, it can be, you can break that up a bunch of different ways. she can be, you can consider her as a one woman under the influence of society, a free woman, a free thinking woman under the influence of society who can't conform her mind to fit into what society feels is normal. And she does, she doesn't really use, we don't see her like popping pills or, getting really drunk. Kind of at the beginning, she drinks some beer at the beginning and then goes and has a huge drink of whatever gin, I guess, before that guy takes her home. But really, that's not really harped on very much throughout the rest of the film. So I wouldn't consider it to be like a woman under the influence of alcohol or drugs or anything like that. But it also could be a woman under the influence of her family, her immediate family, and her husband specifically, and how he is kind of, moving her around within herself and saying, "You can't do that. You can't do this. I love you. Don't ever change." He's kind of pushing her one way and then pushing her the other way. It's a manipulative thing, but he may not even know. He may not even be conscious that he's doing that. That may be something that's within him that maybe feels like he needs to push her one way or pull her another way to keep her close or to keep her feeling like she needs him or something. So I think it could be any of those.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think answering that question of what the title of the movie means or what it means to you is the answer to the questions that I just posed and the answer to the questions that we've been posing through this podcast. Because I remember in the 70s when this movie first came out, of course I thought it meant that she was under the influence of alcohol or drugs or something. Yeah. And in that scene, the street scene, she does seem like she's overly bearing, like a drunk person can be. But I'm starting to believe, for me, it's a woman under the influence of everybody but her. Everybody except for what her mind's eye tells her to do. Because there's so much building on what is socially normal, yet strangely set up. Like it's 7, 8 o'clock in the morning when all those people come over for spaghetti. And by the way, what's the deal with spaghetti in this movie? Like they mention it like 7 times, but I don't know. I don't know if spaghetti means something. Is it a metaphor for something? Because spaghetti is what they cook in that first meal, and spaghetti is what they're going to eat at that last meal. And they mentioned spaghetti a couple other times throughout the movie, and it wasn't until that last meal that I went, well, what could spaghetti possibly mean? Like, it's a carb, it's a noodle, it's sauce.
It might just be that they always have spaghetti. That's what I got out of it. Like, I'm not having your spaghetti. Or maybe it's one of those things that's a sacred thing where it's like their Italian family, you don't make spaghetti right.
In my opinion, this film has something deeper at its meaning than just I'm not saying that you're wrong, and I see what you're saying, that spaghetti could just be like a texture to, it's like a purple wall in the kitchen instead of a white wall. It means something, but it doesn't have any bearing per se. But for me, this film is so rich in subtexture and so rich in what it could be and brings up so many questions that it has to be for a reason that spaghetti is the main meal that they eat throughout this entire film. What it is, I have no idea. But yeah, I definitely think now that it's a woman under the influence of society or marriage or a mother-in-law. It's not a woman completely under her own influence, because when she is under her own influence, she makes strange choices to the rest of the world. But that is good up until you're trying to analyze the film and trying to figure out, why did he start the movie the way that he started it? Why did he start it with being stood up, basically, but the husband has to work overnight, and then she goes out and I think it's Seagram's that she drinks. Because there's a big, gin, kind of a small, big deal there. And then she obviously drinks just a little too much, and then she's dancing with that guy at her home. And then she's like, no, get off of me, get off of me. And then they fall on top of the stairs, and you're kind of getting the impression, is he going to abuse her, take advantage of her? And then it shoots to the next day with obviously the intention that they actually had sex, because she's naked in the bed and he's getting dressed and he's doing that kind of like silent walk of shame thing where he's trying to gather stuff up before she wakes up so he doesn't have to deal with her. So that to me means that the filmmaker slash writer of the film meant to say that she can't control her behavior in certain circumstances, because why would she do that? She's happily married. It's just, I think it's one of those films that has to have a class, because you could spend hours trying to analyze it and trying to figure it out. It is not a movie that just washes over you and you take it for what it is. There are reasons behind everything. And the more and more I start thinking about it, or the more and more I've been thinking about it, I'm wondering if it means a woman under the influence of men, because all of the men in her life seem to be influencing her to be something that she's not. And maybe in that circumstance, I'm not trying to rationalize why anybody would have an affair. I'm not trying to say this is the reason why, but maybe in that circumstances, when they fall on the stairs, that for her own safety, she has to go along with this, because she's now stuck between a rock and a hard place, and either gets completely terrorized by this guy or succumbs to this guy. Like, he doesn't give her any other choice. That is not a rationalization or a justification for abusing somebody or raping somebody or taking advantage of somebody. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's what she should have done. I'm saying maybe she's just a woman in a society where she doesn't have control over that stuff. She did bring a guy home, is what people said. She was drunk. That's what people will say. She was dancing with him. That's what people will say. She was wearing a short skirt. That's what people will say. She deserved for this to happen. So maybe in society, women have so much pressure on them that they have to make choices that are the lesser of the two evils. And sometimes that evil is nothing but evil. And so I feel like it's an odd scene to start a movie with, when you notice that her choices are not hers the rest of the film.
Well, and I also think that that's the last thing that I'll bring up, is the fact that this is specifically this movie could specifically only be made with a female as the main character. You can't really flip this movie and make a man be the main character, because, and we even see it in the Peter Falk character, is that if a man made the same decisions or had similar discussions with other men in those settings, then people wouldn't think as much about it. They might just think that he's eccentric. But since she's a woman, there are certain things that it might be more difficult for her to do, like go out to a bar and drink without having to try to prevent herself from, because I don't know if she took a guy home necessarily, quote unquote, took a guy home. He was taking advantage of a situation where she wasn't even basically, conscious on the way home. I'm sure she probably spit out her address at some point, and that's why they made it to her house. But other than that, I don't know how much more input she had in that whole situation, or even the rest of the night. But still, if she were a man and she, whatever, her and his significant other didn't show up, didn't come home on date night, he could just go out to the bar and he could do whatever he wanted, probably without having to worry about any kind of repercussions later on. Similarly, having discussions with another person in your backyard about your kids or whatever is not going to be a big deal. But since she's a woman, that's going to be colored with all of these societal things where women, I'm guessing back then and probably still now, also are expected, certain things are expected to to be said or not be said in certain situations. And it's got to be a lot more complex for women, I would think, than for men. But that's it adds another layer of complexity. There's also certain expectations that I think society still has of women that they don't necessarily have of men. Men may have a little bit more flexibility in what they can get away with.
No, I think they have a lot more flexibility. Let me clarify something. I wasn't saying that she brought the guy home. I was saying that that's what the perception would be.
Sure.
Of if she had said, "Hey, I
know what you're saying.
Attacked by this guy." I just want to make that clear. And I think you're absolutely correct. I think if a guy was to bring home some girl who was too drunk or he was too drunk, it would be a conquest. It wouldn't be an affair. It would be out of retribution for the woman standing him up. It would never be perceived the same way. And, people don't question men about their choices, about their children although they probably should, as much as they question mothers. Men have a longer leash of getting away with stuff in general. So that brings me to the point that maybe we are on to something, that this is the woman under the influence of everybody else, or a man's world, or the societal way people act towards female. And it's got to be tough. And that's why I think my statement about this is a good film for the Me Too movement is that there's just circumstances that women are put into that men are never put into, and it needs to stop, and it needs to move past it in order for us to grow as a world, as a society. I know that's very soap op-ish, and I'm on my box and stuff like that, but that's the truth for me. And this is a great film that says that stuff without it being this soapbox. He says these things in 1974. I mean, he's a very progressive thinker. You can see that, because why would he show the mother being so able to be in control in the beginning of the film? Why would he show that? Did you remember your bike? I'll get it. She remembers the bike. She remembers the suitcases. She remembers blah, blah, blah. What time? She remembers when the kid shows up the next day. She's like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Yes, there's a little bit of, hey, your father and I were kind of like having a good time, and now I'm a little embarrassed. Yeah. But she's like, where's the rest of my kids? And let me see my kids, and all that other stuff. And that big scene at the end where she has to say, may I see my children? It's like, and they're like, well, they're not ready for you and stuff like that. And then finally, for whatever reason, Peter Falk says, yeah, they're in the other room. And then she goes and sees the children. And here's what I find interesting at the end of the film. When you were talking about the father not explaining the situation to them, I think him being so forceful and being so immediate about taking them to the beach is his way of trying to overcompensate for their mother being institutionalized. Like, he doesn't know how to sit down and have a conversation. He's a man of that time where he can't sit down and say, your mother's not feeling well, she's getting looked at by doctors. He doesn't have that communication with his kids. He does have love and respect for his children. You can see all that. That's why he says, I'm going to sit in the back with them on the way home. Then does some semi-twisted stuff that's like, what? Okay, that's questionable. But at the end of the film, even though these children have been involved in this epic battle at the end of this film, and they're being dragged up and down and all around and pushed and go upstairs and change and all that other stuff, the mother says goodnight to each individual child, and she looks at the one son, and they just kind of look at each other, and he volunteers and says, I love you, Mom. And she's like, I love you too. He volunteers that. This is what's in his heart. I'm worried about you, he says. I'm worried. And she's like, I got this, whatever she says. But that to me shows that parent has taught her child, that my love for you is the most important thing. We'll get through all this other stuff, and all this fighting stuff is wrong, and we're probably going to have to pay for a lot of therapy for you for later on in life. But I love you, and I know you love me, and we're worried about each other. That's a healthy balance, in my opinion. A child who's able to, especially the oldest son of a family, is able to verbalize that. There's a lot of healthy stuff there too. So it would be interesting I'm going to do a lot of research on this film and try to find out what people think, and find out if there are clues to how we're supposed to feel in the film based on what John Cassavetes presented to us. But it is a challenging film, but it's worth it in the end, because especially if you're interested in the performance base of this institution of movies, if you're interested in acting, it is some of the best I've seen by two leads in a movie ever. They're just hunkered down in it, and they just make these incredible choices. And I there's this phenomenon, and it's a strange little phenomenon that I've noticed, that there are two leads in a movie, male and female, and she will get a lot of critical acclaim and be an Oscar nomination, and he will not. Happens all the time. Not a big deal. But there are these movies out there where you have to say, if her, why not him? And I'm sure there's a million of the opposite, more so probably than ever. But this is one of those movies that she got an Oscar nomination and he did not. And I'm thinking, He deserved it as much as she did. Now he's a 2-time Oscar nominee. And then I want to say one last thing about him. You were talking about he was deep into Columbo at the time, and he was. He started that in 68. This was 74. He had already been nominated for the Emmy for Columbo. He might have already won it. He was a mainstream TV actor, and he has chosen to do these unusual, finger quote, independent films all the way through his career, because he did Wings of Desire with Wim Wenders, just out of nowhere. Like, he's completely out of place in that movie, but that's an important factor in that movie. And so he has made really good choices as this mainstream actor who all of a sudden does these crazy out of the box things. So I want to make it important that I don't end with just talking about what Peter Falk did, because I think if it wasn't for Gena Rowland and her grounded take on this character and her solid choices that she makes, I think everybody follows her lead. And I think without her, he would not have shined as bright. And, you know, he matched it note for note, but she is just technically amazing, emotionally amazing, and it's really like nothing I've ever seen before. It is a tour de force performance.
Definitely. All right. Well, you can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You can go to facebook.com/actorandengineer, and you can tweet us at actorengineer, and we'll see you next time.